When police entered Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, they found severed heads in the refrigerator, body parts in acid-filled barrels, and a human heart in the freezer. But that was just the beginning of the horror they discovered in apartment 213. Welcome back to Crime Secrets, where we dive into the darkest corners of the human mind. Today's case isn't just about murder. It's about cannibalism, necrophilia, and horrors so unimaginable that they changed how we understand evil itself. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 young men and boys over 13 years, but murder was just the beginning of his crimes. What you're about to hear is the story of America's most notorious serial killer, the Milwaukee Cannibal, who shocked the world and redefined the meaning of monster. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the outside, the Dahmer family seemed normal, middle-class, educated, and living in suburban comfort. But inside their home, dysfunction was brewing. Joyce Dahmer suffered from severe mental health issues, taking cocktails of medications during her pregnancy with Jeffrey. She was often hospitalized for depression and anxiety, leaving young Jeffrey to fend for himself emotionally. Lionel, a chemist, was often absent, buried in his work and unable to connect with his troubled son. Jeffrey's disturbing behaviors began early. At age 4, he was sexually abused by a neighbor, an event that may have triggered his later psychological development. By age 10, he was collecting roadkill, dissecting animals, and preserving their bones in jars. His parents initially thought this was scientific curiosity, but Jeffrey was actually feeding a growing obsession with death and dismemberment. In high school, Jeffrey was a loner who struggled with his sexuality in an era when being gay was heavily stigmatized. He began drinking heavily to numb his confusion and growing violent fantasies. Classmates later recalled that he seemed odd and disconnected, often making inappropriate jokes about death and violence. His parents' marriage was falling apart, filled with screaming matches and threats of divorce. Jeffrey felt abandoned and unloved, retreating further into his dark fantasies. By graduation, he was already planning his first murder. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating high school, 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. The victim was Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker whom Jeffrey picked up and invited to his family home. Jeffrey's parents were going through their divorce and he was alone in the house. He told Stephen they could drink beer and smoke marijuana together. But when Stephen tried to leave, Jeffrey didn't want to be alone again. In a moment of panic and rage, he struck Stephen with a dumbbell, killing him instantly. What happened next revealed the true depth of Jeffrey's depravity. Instead of calling police or disposing of the body immediately, Jeffrey began experimenting. He dismembered Stephen's corpse, dissolving some parts in acid and burying others around the property. He kept Stephen's skull as a trophy. For the next 9 years, Jeffrey managed to control his urges. He joined the army but was discharged for alcoholism. He lived with his grandmother, worked various jobs, and seemed to be trying to lead a normal life. But the fantasies never stopped. He was planning, learning, and waiting for the right opportunity to kill again. In 1987, Jeffrey's grandmother asked him to move out due to his drinking and strange behavior. He found his own apartment at 213 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This address would become synonymous with horror. Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses, targeting young men who were often from marginalized communities, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. His victims were typically Black or Latino men, chosen because Jeffrey knew police investigations would be less thorough. His second victim was Stephen Tuomi, whom he met at a bar in November 1987. Jeffrey claimed he didn't remember killing Stephen, saying he woke up to find the man dead in their hotel room. But the pattern was established. Jeffrey would lure victims with the promise of money, alcohol, or sex, then drug them and kill them. What made Jeffrey different from other serial killers was what he did after the murders. He didn't just kill, he preserved. He would photograph his victims at various stages of decomposition, dismember their bodies, and keep parts as trophies. He began experimenting with necrophilia and cannibalism, driven by a desire to keep his victims with him forever. Jeffrey's method was calculated and efficient. He would drill holes in his victims' skulls while they were still alive, attempting to create compliant zombies by pouring acid or boiling water into their brains. Most victims died from this procedure, but Jeffrey continued his experiments, convinced he could create the perfect permanent companion. By 1991, Jeffrey's apartment had become a chamber of horrors. Neighbors complained about terrible smells coming from apartment 213, but Jeffrey always had explanations: spoiled meat, backed up plumbing, dead animals. The landlord and neighbors accepted these excuses, not wanting to investigate further. Inside the apartment, Jeffrey had created his own personal museum of death. The refrigerator contained severed heads and hands, acid-filled barrels dissolved human torsos. The freezer held human hearts and other organs that Jeffrey would later cook and eat. Photographs documenting the murders and dismemberment were carefully organized in photo albums. Jeffrey had also begun keeping souvenirs from each victim. He painted skulls to use as decorations, made jewelry from human bones, and even attempted to create furniture from his victims' remains. He was building a shrine to death and control. The psychological profile that would later emerge showed Jeffrey was motivated by complete domination and possession of his victims. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to own them completely, body and soul. The cannibalism and necrophilia were ways of literally incorporating his victims into himself, making them part of him forever. Jeffrey's killing spree should have ended multiple times, but a combination of police incompetence and societal prejudice allowed him to continue. The most tragic example occurred on May 27, 1991, with 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone. Konorak had escaped from Jeffrey's apartment, naked and bleeding from a hole Jeffrey had drilled in his skull. The boy was incoherent from the acid Jeffrey had poured into his brain, but he managed to flee and was found by two women who called 911. When police arrived, Jeffrey appeared at the scene, calm and collected. He told officers that Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had gotten drunk and wandered off. Despite the obvious signs of trauma and the boy's age, police believed Jeffrey's story. The officers actually escorted Konorak back to Jeffrey's apartment, where the smell of decomposing bodies was overwhelming. But they didn't investigate further, apparently anxious to avoid dealing with what they perceived as a gay domestic dispute. Within hours of the police leaving, Jeffrey murdered Konorak. This incident highlighted the deadly consequences of police prejudice and indifference toward marginalized communities. If the officers had done their job properly, several lives could have been saved. Jeffrey's reign of terror finally ended on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards managed to escape from apartment 213. Edwards had been lured to Jeffrey's apartment with the promise of money for posing for photographs, but quickly realized he was in danger when Jeffrey tried to handcuff him. During a struggle, Edwards managed to partially escape the handcuffs and flee the apartment. He flagged down a police car on the street, still wearing one handcuff and clearly traumatized. Unlike previous encounters, these officers took Edwards seriously and followed him back to Jeffrey's apartment. When police entered apartment 213, they were unprepared for what they found. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of rotting flesh and chemicals. In the refrigerator, they discovered 4 severed heads wrapped in plastic bags. The freezer contained a human heart and other organs. Throughout the apartment, police found photographs of dismembered bodies, human skulls painted and arranged as decorations, and jars containing preserved human organs. Acid-filled barrels contained dissolving human torsos. The scope of Jeffrey's crimes became clear. This wasn't just murder, it was systematic torture, cannibalism, and the creation of the most horrific crime scene in American history. Jeffrey didn't resist arrest or deny his crimes. In fact, he seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the burden of his secret life had become too much to bear. During interrogation, he confessed to 17 murders spanning 13 years. His confession was detailed and emotionless, delivered in a flat monotone that chilled investigators. Jeffrey described his methods of murder, dismemberment, and cannibalism with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a hobby. He explained his motivations, the desire for complete control and possession of his victims. Jeffrey admitted to eating parts of his victims, claiming some tasted better than others. He described drilling holes in their heads while they were alive, attempting to create living zombies who would never leave him. He showed investigators where he had hidden body parts and explained his preservation techniques. What disturbed investigators most was Jeffrey's apparent normalcy during the confession. He wasn't ranting or showing signs of obvious mental illness. Instead, he seemed like an ordinary man describing extraordinary evil, making his crimes even more terrifying. Jeffrey's trial began in January 1992 and became a media sensation. His defense team argued for an insanity plea, claiming that anyone who committed such horrific acts must be mentally ill. But prosecutors successfully argued that Jeffrey's careful planning and attempts to avoid detection proved he knew his actions were wrong. The victims' families testified about their lost loved ones, humanizing the young men Jeffrey had reduced to trophies and meals. The impact statements were heartbreaking, revealing the devastating effects of Jeffrey's crimes on entire communities. On February 15, 1992, Jeffrey was found guilty on 15 counts of murder and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison. Wisconsin had no death penalty, so life imprisonment was the maximum sentence available. Jeffrey served only 2 years of his sentence. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver at Columbia Correctional Institution. Scarver later said he was disgusted by Jeffrey's crimes and his lack of remorse. Jeffrey's death marked the end of one of the most horrific criminal careers in American history, but his legacy of terror continues to haunt our collective consciousness. The Jeffrey Dahmer case forced society to confront the existence of true evil and the failures of systems meant to protect us. His crimes revealed the deadly consequences of prejudice, indifference, and the marginalization of vulnerable communities. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a serial killer, he was a cannibal, a necrophile, and a torturer who pushed the boundaries of human depravity. His story serves as a reminder that monsters are real, they walk among us, and sometimes they live in apartment 213. If this case disturbed you as much as it should, subscribe to Crime Secrets for more investigations into the darkest corners of the human mind, because understanding evil is the first step in preventing it.